Hey guys, I'm Chris Buck and a very warm welcome to Friday Fretworks, and this week my Fender Super Reverb, the amp that shouldn't exist. So a few months back, just before Cardinal were due to head out on tour with Peter Frampton, stopped into a great little guitar shop in Cardiff called Motor Music. A good mate of mine, Ed, a man you'll probably recognise from some recent episodes of Friday Fretworks, suggested that I stop in and take a look at a rather interesting, somewhat unique Fender Super Reverb that he noticed they'd had in stock. Now, if you've been watching Friday Fretworks for the last few months, you'll know that I've been having a little bit of an amp quandary, to say the least. I knew that tour in particular was going to be such a marked step up in terms of venue size and stage size. I was a little bit worried that my Fender Pro Reverb and my Victory Copper Deluxe, both 1x12 combos, were just going to be a little bit lost, a little bit swamped on stages of those sheer sizes. And as such, I guess I was looking for an amp with a little bit more gravitas. Now, whenever these types of conversations come up with mates and people whose opinion I trust on these kind of things, one amp was consistently being suggested. That is the Fender Super Reverb, an amp that, in all honesty, is a staple part of Fender's lineup, and as of this year, has been around for 60 years. But if I'm entirely honest, an amp that, save for a brief experience with a 90s reissue at Snake Mountain, a studio in South Wales where we recorded a lot of the Cardinal album, not really had much experience with. But I thought, well, what have I got to lose? If the right one comes up at the right price, I would be silly to at least not try it, which is where my amp comes in. I swung by Motor Music in Cardiff to take a look at it, and although I really liked it, didn't pull the trigger. Honestly, can't tell you why at this point. Lost the dim and distant memory of the past, but unsurprisingly, while I was at home deliberating on whether I should get it, someone beat me to the punch and bought the amp. And while I spent the next few months begrudging my bad luck, trying to fill that hole with several other amplifiers, namely a Fender Concert 2 from 1983. That's an interesting amp, actually. That's entirely deserving of a video in its own right, which I shall try and do in the coming weeks. And of course, the 68 custom reissue Vibrolugs, which again, I've done a video on, both of which I've used quite heavily. None of them sounded like the Super Reverb, so you can imagine my delight when I had a phone call from Motor Music saying that, surprise, surprise, the Super Reverb was on its way back. Turns out it had been purchased by a studio known for making Kemper profiles of amps, and that now they'd made the profile, they were just moving it on, and it was actually being sent back to Motor Music in a trade for some other amplifiers. So, rushed back down to Cardiff, plugged in an absolutely killer, actually, custom shop Telecaster, plugged that straight into the front end of the Super Reverb, and it sounded like this. So don't get me wrong, that didn't sound bad, it just didn't sound how I remembered it. If you can see in the video, actually, that the volume on the Super Reverb was at about 5, which, if you've ever spent any time in close proximity to a Super Reverb, you'll know that by that point, 5 o'clock on the dial, you're going to be tearing the paint from the walls, or if you're in close proximity, you're going to be removing the eyebrows from your face quite forcibly. They are quite loud amps, but it felt more like playing maybe a deluxe reverb, both in terms of its headroom and its overall output. Now, I left the shop honestly doubting my sanity, wondering whether I'd just totally misremembered how good or just how this amp sounded full stop, whether I'd spent the last few weeks just trying to convince myself that because I'd missed out on it, it actually sounded better than it did in reality. But thankfully I persevered, convinced the shop to send the amp to renowned local amp tech, Anthony Matthews at Tube Distinctions in South Wales. Thankfully, I wasn't losing my mind, at least not yet, and Tube Distinctions confirmed that it was in fact running single-ended, essentially meaning that it was only running on one of its power output valves, which would go a hell of a long way towards explaining its lack of volume and its lack of headroom. Needless to say, after only a day or so with Tube Distinctions, it was back to its best, and I did what I should have done probably 6 months or so earlier. Took the plunge. Which, I guess, brings us to the question, what the hell is it? Technically speaking, this started life as a 1967 Fender Super Reverb, but at least officially, no Super Reverb ever left the factory looking like this. If you're familiar with your basic kind of Fender amp chronology or just a cursory bit of their history, the brown panel or the brown face era, of course, ending in 1963, just as the Super Reverb was introduced. I guess as such, there is a very slim outside possibility that maybe this was a custom order or a one-off, or maybe someone in the factory put it together from bits that were otherwise never used. But it seems infinitely more likely to me, at least, that for whatever reason, someone at some point in its history has gone to great length, time and effort to make this look like, I guess, a fictional Super Reverb. Much closer in appearance, actually, to its predecessor, the 4x10 Concert, than definitely anything Fender has ever produced. But thankfully, such a unique, distinctive amp does leave a trail online, and I've been able to track down its movement for at least the last 7 or so years, the first mention of which I can find dating back to 2016 with a brilliant article on this very amp published in ToneQuest Reports, detailing the process of them actually finding it at a storage facility in Atlanta, Georgia, at which point the brown modifications had already been done, but at least internally this amp appeared kind of virtually intact. Crucially, with its original output transformer, which dated the amp to October of 1967. Now, again, if you're familiar with the amp chronology or Fender amp chronology or history, that's an interesting date because that puts it very much as a transitional amp. Now, if you saw the Pro Reverb episode I did recently, of course, by late 67, early 68, Fender were migrating pretty much the entirety of their amp range over from their pre-existing black panel or blackface design over to this silver panel or silverface design. And it seems likely to me that at least by October 67, this would have been a silver panel. And something else I found online to kind of back that up is an amp very close, a Super Reverb, very close in serial number to mine, about 100 or so before, I think, which was a silver panel. So it seems marginally more likely to me that that is originally how it would have looked. But again, a large degree of that is, of course, speculation. The next mention I can find of the amp is only a few months later, with ToneQuest Reports, the magazine, actually selling it directly through their reverb page in Decatur, Georgia. Clearly made its way out west, because the next reference I can find to it is it for sale about a year later. This was kind of in the pandemic at this point, at Thunder Road Guitars in Seattle. If you flick back through their Instagram, you'll actually find a great photo of it being used as, I guess, a bit of a prop to sell a Telecaster. It's such a distinctive looking amp that immediately caught my attention, flicking back through kind of reams and reams of stuff on their Instagram. Crucially, however, by this point, was missing its original transformer and its original speakers. I guess what happened to that transformer is, again, a matter of speculation, but given the kind of replaced speakers as well, it seems likely to me that someone possibly blew a speaker. It's quite easy to do in a Super Reverb and not even notice that one of them's gone. Of course, that 4x10 configuration, you wouldn't necessarily notice it, but if you did blow a speaker, it would be entirely likely that very quickly would follow would be the output transformer. It was replaced with a very worthy Mercury clone, and the 4 original speakers were replaced with Warehouse Veteran 10s. The amp hung around at Thunder Road Guitars for a little while before, funnily enough, making its way all the way over to the UK, actually being imported into Wales, believe it or not, specifically Mold in North Wales. A friend of mine then purchased it from that guy, bringing it back down to South Wales, before eventually trading it in for another amp, Motor Music in Cardiff, before I picked it up, thus completing its somewhat epic journey, if we're honest. Now, the only thing worth mentioning that I've done to the amp since I bought it is change 3 of the speakers from those Warehouse Veterans to Celestion G10 Vintage, just to try and increase the headroom. We'll get into the specs on the speakers in a second, but at the conclusion of that epic journey and the kind of little bit of modifications that I've done, sounds like this. So what do I think of it? Honestly, I love it. There was a brief moment at the first rehearsal where I was a little bit worried that there wasn't going to be enough headroom in the amp for what I was looking for. Of course, I tried it fairly extensively in the shop and at the amp techs as well once it was fixed, but there's no real way of telling how that's going to fare in context to a drummer and a live band. So there was a brief moment of worrying, but honestly, as I said, changing those speakers from the Warehouse Veterans with their sensitivity of around 94 decibels, rated at 20 watts each, to those Celestion G10s with a sensitivity of 98 decibels, might not sound much, but that's a massive difference, with a power rating of 60 watts, has honestly transformed the amp. Naively, I guess, on my part. I'd never really considered speaker change as anything other than, I guess, a tonal change. But it's probably worth mentioning that actually, that conversely, if you're not looking to necessarily get more headroom out of an amp, as I was, a way of taming a somewhat unwieldy beast like a Super Reverb, if you're basically again just looking to break up at lower volumes, change your speakers to something of a much lower efficiency. It really does transform the amp. It's like a totally different amp under the fingers. But having been out on the road with this for the last few weeks now, it's really blowing me away every night. Of course, I'm pairing it with that Pro Reverb rather that you would have seen in my rig rundown last week, and I've not really been as happy with my guitar sound on stage for a very long time, if ever. I guess some of the stages we're playing on this tour have been fairly large as well, which have really given me a chance to kind of dial the amp in and hear it well on stage and not be sort of curtailed by noise restrictions, etc, etc. But it's just been an absolutely joyous experience, and I'm so glad that an amp which I guess has been on a bit of a journey by all accounts, seems to have finally found its home. I'm a bit of a bugger for not really parting with anything at the best of times, so I can't imagine this is going anywhere anytime soon. I'm going to play you out now, but as ever, I'm Chris Buck. This is Friday Fretworks. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe, hit the bell icon if you haven't already, and I shall see you next week for another episode of Friday Fretworks. Cheers, guys. Speak soon.